This talk is part 3 in a series of 6, which I plan to do all about the American War of Independence. Number 3. If you want a title, we could call it Who Saw the War Coming? At the end of talk number 2, I left you, I hope, with the impression that during the middle of the 18th century, possibly even starting earlier, we can now see with hindsight that the situation between the colonists and the home country of Britain was getting worse. We can always see that from the point of vantage of history, can't we? And it led indeed to a very, very big event, the American War of Independence. But because it was such a big event, and because it's attracted the attention of lots and lots of historians on both sides of the Atlantic, it's a very natural tendency to assume that everybody knew all about it, or to put it another way around, that it was such a big thing that everybody must have seen it coming. Not so. At the end of the second talk, I showed you, I hope, that the situation was bad and getting worse. But it doesn't necessarily follow that it was going to lead irrevocably to war. Times were indeed changing, as times have an unfortunate habit of doing. And it is also true that neither side could produce any kind of solution to deal with it, to stop the rot, stop the inevitable surge towards war. And therefore, part of the legend doesn't stand up. The villains in this piece are usually the British Parliament, the MPs, the politicians, and of course the King, George the tyrant. But think about it for a minute. These politicians in England were ordinary human beings like everybody else. The members of Parliament, the English government, were not wicked men bent on making life hell for colonists. They were probably, for the most part, second-raters bumbling along like everybody else and doing their best. And also, too, they didn't regard the colonists as some kind of riffraff who've got to be pushed around and made to mind. The colonists were Englishmen. They were Englishmen who'd left the mother country to go and make a home somewhere else, and they must be treated as Englishmen. But, as one historian said, the trouble was that the vast majority of these men, possibly, dare I suggest it, perhaps on the other side of the Atlantic too, second-rate men, doing their best according to their lights. Trouble was, their lights were a bit dim. It's not for me to comment on the dim or otherwise of the lights of American politicians, but the Englishmen, certainly. There was only one first-rater amongst the English politicians, and that was William Pitt, the elder Pitt, the Earl of Chatham. And of course, life being what it is, he was the one man who was not able to take part because he was prostrated by a very virulent nervous disease, which made him virtually unable to take part in politics for 2 or 3 vital years. And by the same token, just as English ministers were not bent on making life hell for colonists either, in their own way, didn't spend 30 years plotting revolution in tavern cellars. They too bowled along and did their best according to their lights. And they got more and more afraid, rightly or wrongly, that their liberties were being eroded, the liberties that they already had. The only minister they trusted was Pitt, and he wasn't available. It all went, well, it didn't all go back. It went back before 1763, but it got markedly worse in 1763 because that was the end of the 7 Years' War, one of the many wars we fought against the French, one of the most triumphant and successful wars. And as a result of it, we doubled the size of the British Empire. Now, that was fine. As they said, the church bells in England never stopped ringing to celebrate yet another English victory. During the year of 1759, it was called the Annus Mirabilis, Latin, the Annus Mirabilis, the miraculous year. But when it was all over, when they put the flags away and stopped cheering, British government realised that they had inherited a pretty hefty problem. All this new empire had to be run, particularly in America. We had a vast amount of territory which we had been given perhaps unwillingly, by the French. And it had to be governed. It had to be given administration. It had to be given justice. It had to be given defense. That cost money. And the government wondered, quite not surprisingly, that the British public might not be willing to pay for it all. 3,000 miles away, why pay all that money? Nothing to do with us. So what were they going to do? The situation was compounded shortly after the war by an event which happened in America, which greatly concerned the American colonists, but again didn't concern the English very much. A very powerful American chieftain called Pontiac put together a vast union of several Indian tribes, and they burst upon the colonists and set the frontier aflame from Niagara, pretty well, I believe, down to Virginia. It was a very serious business indeed. And the colonists couldn't handle it themselves. They were our colonies, so the British government had to defend them, and defend them they did. And they dealt with Pontiac's conspiracy. They sent over more redcoats, and the conspiracy, if it was not totally extinguished, at least the colonists were saved from being obliterated. All that cost money. And Grenville, the English Prime Minister, scratched his head and wondered what to do. Well, if he didn't think the English public would wear it to pay for American defense and American government and American justice and all the rest of it, how about asking the Americans themselves to contribute to their own government, their own courts, their own administration, and their own defense? What did governments usually do? They imposed customs duties. They milked some of the profit from trade. It had been going on for centuries. It went right back to Henry VII, even earlier. So he would raise the customs duties, which he duly did. What did the Americans do? What did the colonists do? They grumbled, but everybody grumbles about rising taxes, don't they? But it didn't seem to be enough to plug the gap. So Grenville came up with another idea in 1765. He decided that there will be a stamp put on every public document, a lease, a contract, a mortgage, a will, anything you can think of would have to bear a stamp, and that stamp would cost money. And the money would be paid by the colonists, and the money raised would not go to England, it would go to the defence of the colonies. For their own defence, they would have their own tax to which they would contribute their own money. As far as Grenville could see, seemed perfectly routine and reasonable. He'd done it in England, they'd been doing it in England for centuries. To his amazement, there were revolts in every single one of the 13 colonies. Mr. Morrison, that distinguished American historian I told you about last time, gave an account of one such incident. He said, on the very day the Stamp Act came into operation, a howling New York mob forced the Lieutenant Governor to take refuge on board a British warship. The mob then broke into the governor's coach house, destroyed his carriages, and forced the officer in charge of stamped paper to burn the lot. Some of them then marched up Broadway to a country estate on the River Hudson, which had been leased by a British officer who had threatened publicly to cram the Stamp Act down the people's throats. They gutted his house, destroyed furniture, books, china, drank up his liquor, uprooted his garden, and departed carrying the regimental colours as a trophy. Pretty strong stuff. And apparently there were incidents, whether they were quite as dramatic as that or not, I don't know. But there were violent incidents in every single one of the 13 colonies. Grenville and the British government were absolutely stunned. Damn it, it was only a tax, for heaven's sake. All governments tax all peoples to raise money to run the country. But you see, the trouble was, it offended a particularly articulate section of the population. Not everybody had great need of legal documents, but teachers did, lawyers did, doctors did, merchants did, publishers did, writers did. These men were all educated men, aware men, articulate men, self-made men, and because of all that, they were touchy. They were affluent, they were energetic, they were very articulate. So they were going to cause a lot of trouble. They weren't just going to go to the local tavern and grumble and go back home and go to bed. Oh, no, no, no. They were going to make a noise, and make a noise they duly did. Not only that, they realized that it was not enough simply to say, I don't like the Stamp Act very much. They had to somehow turn the Stamp Act into something, into a weapon. They had to turn the annoyance of people about the Stamp Act into a weapon. And the way of doing that was to turn an argument into a slogan. And they came up with the idea that the Stamp Act was unique in its ability to oppress the Americans because it was what they called an internal tax. They didn't mind external tax, as they said, but an internal tax was the government of Westminster interfering in the private personal lives of American citizens. So we don't want an internal tax. And then they came up with a second slogan, which possibly was going to be even more powerful and even more influential. They conjured up the argument that we must oppose the Stamp Act, and it's not right, and it's not even legal. Never mind unfair, it was illegal, said the colonists, because no colonist had been in Westminster, in Parliament, to vote for it. Well, if we don't vote for it, surely we're not bound to obey it, are we? So they came up with a slogan, no taxation without representation. A couple of good long words there. It looked very dignified. It carried a great deal of apparent legal and moral clout. So they didn't want an internal tax, and they didn't want taxation without representation. Well, because of all this, Grenville, the English Prime Minister, again, don't forget, this was 3,000 miles away. News took 8 weeks to cross and come back. Grenville felt that really had no choice but to give way. He had to think of something else. And surprisingly, the king himself said the same. So much for George the Tyrant. And the Earl of Chatham, the one man they trusted from his sickbed, offered the opinion that you've no choice. You've got to repeal. So the decision was taken to repeal the Stamp Act. But bearing in mind what I said in the beginning about the coming of the war, it's interesting that throughout this pretty well entire episode, there's no talk of independence. Not there. Bye.